Good afternoon, good morning, depending upon where you're joining us from. I'd like to welcome you to Appsian's webinar today. We're going to be discussing natively integrating SAML 2.0 into both PeopleSoft and Oracle eBusiness Suite. So who we are, a little bit of just a meeting logistics and things like that. Since we are using GoToWebinar, if you have any questions about the session today, everybody is muted, so please just use the GoToWebinar control panel to submit questions. It's typically on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can use the question and tab to go ahead and submit any questions during the session, and I'll make sure that those get answered or talked about during the webinar as we talk today. So from an agenda perspective, my name is Greg Wendt. I'm the Executive Director for the Security Solutions here at Appsian. And what we're going to be covering off on is an introduction, evolution of single sign-on, PeopleSoft SSO, also be talking about EBS SSO, and integrating SAML really into ERP apps as a whole. Going to demo all of the solutions that we're talking about today, and then some of the hints and tips, and also any sort of Q&A. So if there's a question that comes up that you don't want to talk to or ask about on the webinar today, you can also email us at info@appsian.com as well, and we'll be sure to follow up. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we talk about who Appsian is and why we're here talking to you about these things, so what we do is we'll protect sensitive data within a lot of different ERP systems. Obviously, today we're going to be talking about SSO inside of PeopleSoft and EBS, but we also work with SAP as well. We do that through our application security platforms. Those application security platforms are small things that sit inside of those target ERP systems, whether it be PeopleSoft, SAP, or EBS, for us to be able to integrate and control and protect data. We also have what we call our A360 platform, which gives you visibility as to what users are doing inside of the applications. And that's going to be external. So the two of those tools together actually allow us to do many of the things that we talk about. We are an Oracle partner as well as an SAP certified solution. So we were founded by ex-PeopleSoft developers after the Oracle acquisition. The security product line has been around since 2012. Some of you may know us from an older name of Gray Heller. We rebranded Appsian in 2018, and really what we do is leverage ERP systems to extend the ROI within those systems. So without having to implement additional customizations and increase the costs on those. So we do have over 250 customers worldwide. And when you look at a small splash of some of those customers, you're going to see that we're within multiple different verticals. You can see the different areas: government, commercial, financial, healthcare up across the top, and you can see some of the different companies that we work with inside of that space. Many of these customers take advantage of our SSO implementations because they want to integrate their ERP systems within the rest of their SSO suite. So regardless of whatever vendor they might be using. So that's one of the common features that we do see across many of our customer bases, and that's really because of a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about within the session today. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So if we think about what's happening with legacy systems and some of the main challenges that they're having to work with is you're seeing a remote workforce. Everybody knows the last 18 months to almost 24 months, the way it seems, has been very challenging from most organizations as a whole. I know some organizations that have gone back to work, some haven't gone back to work, some went from completely work from home. Now we're only a couple of days in the office, some have skeleton crews. So it's still a very challenging environment for where your workers and your employees are actually going to be accessing your systems from. So when you're talking about automation and identity management and single sign-on, it becomes very important. Also, one of the things that's really changed is the form factors. What type of devices are people actually using to access your content? And by content, I mean your applications. is it going to be an iPad? Is it going to be a desktop? Is it going to be a laptop? I know there's been a massive shift to laptops because of the amount of people that have gone remote over the last 18 months. And really what that does too, when you're thinking about all those extra connections into your system, is it increases your exposure. If you look back through what happened with COVID, when organizations and the pandemic was hitting certain areas of the globe, you could also watch the bad guys, the threat actors increased the attack vectors inside of those particular areas that were seeing increased exposures. So it was something that you could definitely watch go hand in hand, because what it did was it created chaos, and a lot of these organizations had to move very quickly and make changes to how they manage security and maybe how their systems were being accessed. Static access controls don't necessarily work. That was one of the things that they had to change. It was real easy when before COVID, everything was inside the firewall and nobody needed access at home and nobody did anything like that. It was all up. Everybody comes in, they sit at their desktop, and they're going to access the servers here on-prem. And then also, if you think about it, there's how many different enterprise applications do you actually use inside of your organization as a whole? We talk to organizations all the time that have multiple of the major large ERP systems, whether that's PeopleSoft, SAP, Workday, Oracle Cloud. It's very common to end up with multiple of the very large ERP systems, and not to mention some of the very diverse point solution applications that you're going to be utilizing. And what that causes, or really builds a challenge around, is your security approach. How are you going to have a very coordinated security approach when some of your applications might be using SAML, some of them might be using just Active Directory, even though it's kind of shared credentials? It's not really true single sign-on, because you still have to manage those particular credentials within that target application. And with that, you don't really have a single point to turn things off if things go bad, or when a user decides they're going to leave your organization. In true single sign-on, you can flip a switch in one spot and it's going to turn off all the target access points. So, that uncoordinated security approach really can bring you some unexposed data and really how people are accessing the applications, which is going to be an additional challenge with how you're going to manage those users. When we think about single sign-on in a nutshell, it really is going towards the advantages of utilizing a centralized system for identity trust. It really allows that particular system to manage the connections into all of your other applications. So multiple applications really do use the same logon, and what that is it's allowing the applications to go back to that identity trust and say, does this user have a session? Do they not have a session? How do I need to treat this user? What am I going to use to allow this user to access the system? How are we going to manage roles, permissions, all those other types of things? And the passwords are stored in a single repository, which when you think about that single repository, now it becomes far easier to implement additional password controls. Some applications still maybe only take an 8-character, a 10-character, or 12-character password. Maybe they do or don't allow special characters or numbers inside of those. And if you go to an identity trust that really specializes in security controls, that's what this software does. That's their main point, is to provide user IDs, access, resetting of passwords, those types of things. So it becomes you're actually going to a best of breed type solution for your authentication model. So all of those extra controls, the adaptive security that you can put in there, and managing the passwords in one particular location, there's a lot of advantages to. And it really, that's why organizations have jumped on this, especially in the last probably 2 to 3 years. It's been something of high interest in a lot of organizations because of the pros of what you get out when you actually get this done and complete it. When you're utilizing a centralized identity provider, there's definitely some key things that your organization can do. It's a single point for servicing credentials for all users. So when you're talking about that, it really allows you to put all of those controls in one place. Everybody's going to be going back. I think about it from my enterprise architect days and how often we would have 20 to 30 different PeopleSoft systems when you're in the middle of an upgrade, for example. And, I've got this copy and this one might have, queries in it. And this one's just a tools upgrade. And this is what we're doing. And, so when you're talking about all of that, each one of those has their very own user ID password credentials. And typically users just, set everything to the same thing because it's a copy of production and it moves down. So if a bad actor or somebody gains access to a system, it's very easy to, go in and out of all 20 to 30 of these different systems and have, really controls that you shouldn't have based upon what that user is able to do inside of those systems. So moving to a centralized identity provider really takes that single point and moves it off of the controls of your ERP system. And that unified set of rules for password complexity and expiry are very important. How many people, when you're talking about doing password aging, expiry, complexity, if you're utilizing, let's say even PeopleSoft two-tier user IDs and password kind of situations, you have certain limitations as to what you can do there. It's not as complex and verbose as what you can do within an identity provider. So that unified password history really helps. Keeps track of all of the different, what were the last 10, 12, 15, passwords you utilize, so you can make sure that people are not reusing the same passwords or changing the password and then immediately changing it again back to what it was before, type of things. But another area that some organizations think about and others don't is really the reduction of help desk or service desk labor. Because when you're talking about resetting passwords, it allows them to go into one particular place to reset it. You don't have to go into all of those different target systems. Going back to my enterprise architect days with PeopleSoft, it's like we always had PeopleSoft security administrators, and what they would do is go in and manage, all right, I've got to update all of these people, I've got to create new accounts, I've got to do all this account maintenance, I've got to add different roles to these people. There was a lot of work involved with that. And also, it's a lot easier when you don't have to worry about the user ID and passwords matching. It makes it a lot easier from that particular situation. They can just set up an account and tie the roles to those users, work on their permission list, boom, off they go. So, which typically isn't something that your help desk is going to have to do. The help desk could quickly reset the password for them within the identity provider, and off they go. So, and it's another step to maybe the passwordless future that some organizations talk about in the future. So there's obviously a lot of benefits when we talk about utilizing single sign-on and the drivers for it. Typically, it's a blend of where the drivers for single sign-on are going to come from. Obviously, it's going to be about strengthening your IT policy and simplifying how you work with your users. That's always a goal of IT. Well, it always should be. You always want to simplify and strengthen your policies and procedures, because when they're simple, they're easy to follow, and when they're strong, they're harder to break. Also, you want to get to the point of where you can instantly do provisioning and decommissioning of user accounts. Should users be able to access the system, after they put in a notice? How long are you going to give them? Or what happens if you have to walk out an employee? Are you going to turn them off right away? How long does it take to actually enable an employee when they're hired in? Or a student, for example. There's lots of different scenarios as to how long that could take and what type of security access they should actually have. So, and a main driver and benefit for single sign-on is really the efficiency of your end user. I know it seems kind of interesting that, okay, well, putting in another user ID and password doesn't take that long. Well, it does. And what the studies are around that are when users don't have to put in the user ID and passwords, and they can seamlessly move in and out of all these different applications. Because if you think about how diverse your environment is, you're going to have cloud apps, you're going to have on-prem apps, you're going to have all these different application sets. And when users can seamlessly move in and out of all of those, you're going to empower your users. They're going to be more efficient in their job, and it's also going to increase sharing of knowledge and them jumping in and answering a question, because they can, or working with something because they can instantaneously do it. It's not a 5, 6, 7 step process of them getting in and out of certain applications. So it increases productivity and reduces your downtime. And it's also going to increase the trust in your organization because of tying all of these pieces together. And it's going to increase your cybersecurity reputation as well, because ultimately you want to have a more secure environment, and it becomes easier to enforce all of the rules when you're looking at a system where everybody's communicating and logging in and accessing systems the exact same way. When we think about some of the challenges, or history of PeopleSoft single sign-on, really, it started, PeopleSoft is all kind of driven around the PS token. It's proprietary. If you have a PS token, you can maneuver inside of your PeopleSoft applications just fine. So if you have 2 different stacks or 3 different stacks, say HCM, Campus Solutions, and Financials, once you authenticate to one of them, as long as the trusts are set up correctly, you can actually, maneuver in and out of those applications themselves just fine. But typically what we'll see a lot of is LDAP authentication into the application themselves. So it could be maybe you're clearing at a portal, or you're going to log into HCM first, or maybe expenses and financials. It doesn't really matter, but that first connection is most likely going to be authenticated by an LDAP call out. Really what that does is it just leverages the same user ID and password coming from the identity store. So the user has to put those in all together. So it's one of those things when we think about modern single sign-on and tying into the identity providers, it's really a shift to the web-based applications. You're thinking more about ADFS or Azure from a solution perspective of now I'm all on the web. I'm not really dealing with desktop authentication or any of those types of things. When you look at some of the open source versions, you might be looking at Shibboleth, but it's all normally speaking the SAML 2 protocol is what's kind of standardized out there across the board from all of the different identity providers. That's one of the ways that they're communicating in and out of all of these different applications. And that SAML ticket really, once it's created, is what allows you to communicate to all these end applications without having to go back and put in a user ID and password, because that trust is created on that ticket as to who that user is. When we think about the processing flow, just to talk real briefly about what SSO looks like. There's a couple of different ways. You have IdP or the application initiated. So you can go multiple different ways with it, but it's really a large loop and it happens very quickly. You've got your user registry on the back end, and basically as the user is communicating to the application, they're going to have to go back, check with the identity provider, who's going to go back, verify that that user is who they are. They're going to pass some information back to the system. That system's going to have to figure out, based upon an attribute, typically something like the name ID coming in on the SAML ticket, as to who this user is and should I allow him in, and do I trust all of those things. So in a process flow, that's really what's happening. And it's all working back and forth regardless of the endpoint of what that user might be working with, whether it's a desktop, laptop, mobile, or an iPad or some sort of device like that. So it's one of the reasons why it's a very trusted standard within the security environment. It is because it's utilized so heavy. When we think about how the different SAML alternatives could be utilized, typically within a target customer environment, if they've actually gone in and done this, you're going to have to inject quite a bit of custom code into your system. So it's going to be custom people code HTML. You're going to have to insert things inside of the PeopleSoft login process as a whole, and it's going to be challenging to work with, especially when you may have multiple different identity providers that you're going to have to code this for. Another common solution that we see quite a bit of is either reverse proxies, gateways, or agents, to where it might be that they're just screen grabbing basically and injecting, okay, when you put your user ID and password into this particular proxy, it's going to go ahead and inject that into the login screen for you behind the scenes type of thing. So it's often doesn't fully support what the functionality of the product is that you need to be able to support out there. So, and another part is there's external infrastructure involved. So you have to maintain either firewalls, you've got to maintain those servers, the proxies that are running, and all of the validation is done outside of PeopleSoft. So when it's handed in The deep linking is probably a really large challenge with that. It's one of the things that we hear about most frequently. And it's very difficult to, or it can be a challenge to debug and figure out exactly where the system may have broken, if that makes sense. So when we talk about from that particular situation, let's talk about our native solution. And really our native solution here at this particular point is really into both the PeopleSoft and the eBusiness solution. So what we have is a native SAML authentication handler built into our application security platforms. So it's commercial, off the shelf. It's a plug-in into the application itself. So there's no customization, and it's really configuration. And the support and the maintenance of that are included inside of the subscription. I kind of have a picture of our PeopleSoft architecture. I'm going to show the eBiz architecture in just a minute. It's when you're talking about single sign-on, it's something that you're going to see is a very quick and easy demo because the integration is very fast from how it works and integrates into the actual applications themselves. So when we talk about our application security platforms, and I need to kind of level set a little bit just so you guys understand what these systems do and how they plug into the target ERP application. So our security platforms really extend the security policies that are delivered inside of the delivered target app, whether that's EBS or PeopleSoft. It's role-based privileges. They're very static. They're not dynamic. Things don't change. So what we do through our security platforms is bring in a contextual layer. One of those things that we can do is integrate with a single sign-on provider inside of that contextual layer. So we can allow you to authenticate out to that SSO provider utilizing our security platform. It's a small part of the security platform. The security platform really does a whole lot of other things. I'm not going to cover off on all of those. I just wanted you to kind of have a baseline to understand that when we talk about our security platforms, they are large platforms that are full featured, that can put a lot of protections into your ERP systems. What we're focusing on here is really dealing with specifically to single sign-on. So I don't want to get sidetracked and don't want to bore you guys that are specifically here to see about single sign-on. So that was looking at what we can do from the PeopleSoft system. When we look at our security platform for EBS, we're going to plug into the forms or the browser. We're going to be able to grab that section. We're going to be able to inject security at the forms filter. We also have additional logging, but one of the features that we've really started with on the EBS side is integrating with single sign-on to allow you to have that connection. So one of the things that I think we'll do, because I think it's worth, a picture's worth 1,000 words, is really jump in and start to demo and talk about and show how we can do these different things. So I'm going to change my screen share here real quickly. I'm just going to share this one. So I'm going to start with logging in and out of multiple different systems. So one of the things, and utilizing different identity providers to do that as well. So I'm going to start by logging into, from an example perspective, I'm just going to log into ADFS. And inside of ADFS, I have a link to one of our PeopleSoft systems. That link's going to allow me to drive in. So what I'm doing at this particular point, it's really regardless of the target application that I'm working with. What I'm doing is I'm creating a session with the identity provider. That session is going to basically create that trust. It's going to create that ticket that allows me then to maneuver inside of the rest of my target application. So I'm going to authenticate as Vicky Zinn into ADFS in this example. And what I've done is really created a SharePoint site. I could have used a deep embedded link from email. I could have used one from a desktop. What I've done now though is that session is created with the identity provider. So what's going to happen from here very quickly, and you're going to find the same thing when we do this with EBS as well, is what we're going to do is launch the target application. It's going to check back to the identity provider to see if we have an established session, which is why from a flow perspective, I wanted to show this one, because what it's doing is it's establishing that session with PeopleSoft, or not with PeopleSoft, with the identity provider first. The next way I'm going to show you this is when it when it doesn't have a session. So by creating that session first, now I can really launch into my ERP systems at will. So I've got a link to PeopleSoft. I'm going to click that. It's going to open a new tab, and you're going to quickly see the URLs flash up at the top, and then I'm into the system. So what all occurred behind the scenes there was there's a mapping of the system, and it's really telling us which attribute we're going to communicate with. There's obviously some trusts and some setup that has to take place from that particular system to be able to communicate to the identity provider. All that's set up and done inside of our target application security platforms, which is why I wanted to give you a little bit of background on that. But once that all is set up and done, the policy engine is going to be able to communicate and talk to the identity provider. It's very easy to change the attributes that you want to communicate on. It could be email address, it could be name ID. That's really a configuration thing that you get to decide what you're going to work with. We've had disparate PeopleSoft systems to where they didn't do like the trusted PeopleSoft single sign-on, and they didn't communicate to each other, and they could be set up to utilize two different attributes. So one used email address and one used name ID, for example. So it's very easy to get up and running at that particular point, and it's a very quick turnkey solution. When we start talking, I'm going to show a little bit of a different connection to this. And what I want to do in this scenario is I'm going to start by not authenticating to the identity provider first. So I'm going to just make a request to the PeopleSoft system. So I am just going to click a link here. And what that link's going to do is it's going to immediately challenge me with my user ID and password credentials. And this is because I have not created that particular user ID and password. I don't have that SAML ticket. I haven't done anything yet. So I need to create that trust. And to do that, I need to put in my user ID and password. So I'm going to go ahead and put in my OKTA credentials. As you'll see, this is OKTA and not ADFS. And this is coming into the exact same PeopleSoft system. The page that I happen to be loading into has all of the photos on it, so it actually takes a little bit longer to get into. So you can see from a PeopleSoft system, I'm working with hrm.appsian.com, our co, same up here. So working with two very different systems and two browsers utilizing two different authentication providers to be able to do that. So it's all configuration. There isn't anything that you have to do inside of the system. I'm going to go ahead and bring over another system here, and I want to switch gears a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about EBS. So when we're talking about authenticating into the EBS system, it's very similar for exactly what we just saw from a PeopleSoft perspective. Do you have a session created? Do you not have a session created with the application? How is this user going to access the system? But the main key part is we want them to utilize SAML, which is a challenge inside of the EBS system. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a browser window. And I'm just going to go ahead and put in the URL, and I'm going to leave that URL up here for a second. So what you can see is that I'm actually making a request of the Oracle system. So I'm going to go to the home page basically. So as I hit enter, it's basically going to be the exact same process of what I discussed within the PeopleSoft system. So from an end user perspective, it's identical. Same interactions, same workflows that we're having to go through. So as I hit enter, EBS is going to see that there's not an active session, and it's going to challenge with the identity provider. This one's going to be configured with OKTA as well. So as I hit enter, it's going through. You're going to see that I now have to put in my credentials with OKTA. So I'm going to go ahead and put in my user ID and go ahead and put in my password. Once I hit sign in, what you're going to see is it's going to drop me into the EBS application. I have my roles and permissions just like I did within the target system of PeopleSoft, and now I'm able to access the system and maneuver about doing whatever I need to be able to do. As the user works with the system, I happen to be set up as an administrator within this demo system. Obviously, that's not normally people are, but it would be normal roles and permission lists that are defined that user's going to have within the system. So just real quickly, I think there's a question or two that might have come through, so I'm going to check those real quick. Yes, we will be covering the business suite, just hit on that. How does this work with native PS2 tier app designer data mover logins? So that one's actually a little bit more specific to the PeopleSoft systems. What we have from the native PS2 tier logins is we have a setup of what we call as our client SSO, and we have configured that to where it works within our same setup and controls, but it allows you to work with a SAML authentication model utilizing any browser with the two-tier application, so App Designer or Query, for example, and if you have anybody using the query version of the client. And then the data mover login as well. So you can utilize that SAML. So it can really get rid of, some of that two-tier access. We do have another question that came in on EBS. Does our system work with the old 11.2 versions, or does it require R12? I'm going to take that as a to-do. Because I want to confirm with the releases with my team, because I know there are some differences between some of those, and I don't want to give you a wrong answer. So I'm going to ask somebody who's on the call to actually make sure that we follow up with you on that particular questioning, because we want to get you all of the facts and the right answer there. So one of the other challenges that we see, and I'm actually going to go back to PeopleSoft here real quick to do this, is frequently inside of what we see with single sign-on is you still have, especially in PeopleSoft, where you have the requirement for two-tier user accounts. One of the questions came in earlier about what happens with App Designer, Data Mover, those types of things. Well, what happens with a PeopleSoft administrator and an admin, maybe a DBA, something like that, who's typically not inside of their identity provider? And I can tell you, I've talked to probably thousands of customers on this, and I've found very rarely are 100% of the accounts configured within your identity provider. It just is very, very rare. So one of the things that we've developed around this, and it kind of goes hand in hand, which is one of the reasons why I thought I would show it, is we've actually developed a way to switch into a privileged account. The easiest way to describe this is actually what's, if you're used to Unix, it's a SU, so it allows you to switch into a different account and creates a log and tracks that when it's going on. So we call it our privileged account access. And it kind of goes hand in hand with single sign-on very frequently, which is why I thought I would show it. So I have actually configured that this particular user, Vicky Zinn, can switch into several other higher privileged accounts. So I'm going to go ahead and switch into PS1. And when I do that, I am now creating an entire new session inside of the system. The nice part about that is, especially if you're utilizing our client SSO, is now that user really doesn't have to have, those connections. So this user is now logged in and able to do whatever they need to do. It's a high privileged user, so I've got much more access inside of the system than what I did anywhere else. And when I'm done, I can just hit the little pagelet and actually move back to my Vicky Zinn session that was currently logged in at the beginning. So this is something that we see that goes hand in hand. One of the key things that's important with it is the fact that it gets logged. So when you do have a user that comes in, originally signed in as, let's say, Vicky Zinn in this demo session, and they transition into that higher privileged account, we're going to log what they do inside of that higher privileged account, tying it back to their initial Vicky Zinn access. That way, if you have multiple people who are sharing or utilizing that account, maybe it's a batch account, setting up run controls, something like that. You can actually see which user did what and when they access the system and what data they worked with. So that is something that we have definitely seen. So with that, I'm going to flip back over to the PowerPoint. So when we talk about a successful, project in single sign-on, and what does it look like? It really enables you to ensure the seamless interaction with both PeopleSoft and EBS, and it brings those applications into the rest of your security profile to where they're utilized and accessed the exact same way, as you could see, during the demo today. And one of the important parts too is that we don't want to make the environments any more convoluted or difficult to work with than they already are. It's one of the challenges with ERP systems as a whole, is injecting additional servers, customizations in. One, it's gonna not lower your return on investment. It's going to make it harder. It makes it harder to take updates and changes from the vendor because you've made these particular customizations inside of your system specifically for SSO. And that's something you really don't want to do. You don't want to inject additional hardware when it's not required, and you don't want to have to implement those customizations, because it's just going to increase. Both of those are going to increase your carrying costs over time, which is not what you want to do with a solution. We're also going to reduce the alterations required on the ERP lifecycle management. If we think about how they're interacting with the system, we're not, modifying the core code. We're delivering these in a way to where you're still going to be able to uptake those changes in a very quick manner. And then also, when you're talking about customized versus a delivered solution, like what we're presenting here, really one of the key factors is getting the turnkey full utilization of the product itself. So when you're talking about deep link navigation, I'm emailing something out to my particular employees. It could be anything from go update your benefits to submit expenses, approve expenses, and that user needs to click the email. They need to enter into the target ERP system, whether that's PeopleSoft or EBS. They want to do that efficiently and quickly to be able to go in and update whatever they need to be able to update from a workflow. Yeah, okay, that expense is good. Let's go do that real quick. So when you're talking about integrating and working with deep navigation, that's important. And it's something that you can't really underestimate, especially from the end users, the power of the solution, because it is something that really gives them the full working, workability of the product themselves, of what they should be able to do inside of their ERP systems. And it also allows for identity provider flexibility. That's one of those things, talking about the number of customers that we have running our SSO integrations. It's something that I kind of figured, in all honesty, I didn't really think that changing the identity providers was something that happened as frequently as it does. But it is something that definitely happens quite frequently. We see it a lot, which is one of the reasons why, I demoed actually utilizing 2 different identity providers into an ERP system, is because it's common. I know organizations that utilize 5 to 6 different identity providers, which sounds really, really crazy on the grand scheme of things. But that's what happens sometimes when you procure by different organizations. There's mergings that are going on, and ultimately it comes down to flexibility and what's the solution that makes the most sense for your organization as a whole. So moving between those gives you a greater flexibility. And if you go the customization route, let's say that you were doing on-prem and you were using Active Directory, for example, and now maybe you're shifting to OKTA, or you're moving to Ping, or you're moving to some other provider that's completely on the web, it's a very different integration, and trying to tie all those into your target application. So, there's really a lot of hidden costs when you're talking about implementing custom solutions, especially within the single sign-on type of environment. So I see there's been a couple more questions come in. So I'm actually going to touch on those in just a second. So when we talk about the integration and implementation, one of the things that we've got the ability to do is really go live very quickly. you know, the no additional hardware or software, no customizations, you know, versus some of these. I'm not going to go through all the pros and cons. I think you guys can actually put most of those together when we walk through the demo today. You know, when it boils down to it, it's you've got support of a company who's going to stand behind it in what you're doing inside of those systems. So, you know, the fact that you can integrate with multiple identity providers very easily makes all of that well worth its while when you're talking about a customized solution that you may have one, maybe two people who understand on the organization side, you know, how all of those things actually piece together. So let's go back to a couple more questions. So I know we had another one come through. Okay, that one's actually the EBS versions. We're going to follow up with you on that one as well. So, you know, from the perspective of any other questions, one was actually just a nice comment, so I appreciate that as well. But if you do have any additional questions, you can visit us on the web at appsiansecurity.com, and you can also email us at info@appsian.com. This is something that we do specific sessions for a lot of organizations. Really, when we're talking about single sign-on, typically it's about a 30-minute session that we could set up with you, do a deep dive on it. You guys can see, you know, how it's configured, how we do it inside of the target applications, all of those types of things. Ask whatever specific questions that you guys may have about the particular project and how they work. So I would definitely recommend, if there's any interest at all, you know, let's set up a 30-minute session, do that deep dive for you, and be able to answer all of those questions. So outside of that, if there's not any additional questions that have come in, I'd like to thank you guys for your attendance today. I hope you found the session informative, and I look forward to seeing you on another webinar. And I'd like to thank you for joining us from Appsian Security. Appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day.